A psalm of Asaph. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. So quite a short psalm, but please keep it open in front of you if you can, and attend to it as we go through. Now, I wonder how much attention we have paid to this psalm. So I wonder if you've really thought hard about it before or not, and it would be interesting to know. Now, of course, there are 150 psalms, so it may well be that we have not attended closely to this one before. My suspicion is that it's not one that we often attend to, and so the assertion of some scholars about its importance may come as a big surprise. John Dominic Crossan, for example, refers to Psalm 82, and listen to what he says, the single most important text in the Christian Bible. The single most important text in the Christian Bible. Clinton McCann, whose work I love on the Psalter, agrees with him. And then two Germans in their commentary, Hosfeld and Zenger, describe Psalm 82 as one of the most spectacular texts of the Old Testament. And the British-American commentator on the Psalter, John Goldingay, concludes that Psalm 82 stands as one of the most worrying texts in the Old Testament. Okay. Now, if you've never paid much attention to Psalm 82, you should be a bit worried by now, I guess. Okay, but now's your opportunity to attend to it very closely. So the single most important text in the Christian Bible, one of the most spectacular texts of the Old Testament, and for Goldingay at Fuller, one of the most worrying texts in the Old Testament. Now, in my forthcoming The Old Testament and God, I discuss Seth Sanders' assertion that the communicative power of the Old Testament is unique amongst the literature of the ancient Near East. However, as Sanders acutely and perceptively notes, modernity has muted that communicative power. And as a result, too much Old Testament study, and I want to suggest to you, therefore too much Christianity bears the mark of that muting of the powerful communicative voice of the Old Testament. Psalm 82 presents us with an opportunity, an invitation to begin to recover the power and the extraordinary comprehensiveness of the message of the Bible. Now, you may or may not know, and Dave's class, I think you will be learning about this in the course of your study of the book of the Psalms, that in recent decades, work on the book of the Psalms has proven to be particularly fertile. Now, sometimes you find that Christians read the book of the Psalms as something like a psalm a day keeps the devil away. Now, of course, there are worse ways to read the Psalter, at least you're reading it. But what scholars have noted as they've studied the book of the Psalms, that it is not just made up of 150 individual psalms, but that the book of the Psalms has the shape of a carefully edited literary whole. Now, let me just give you can ask me in more detail about this in question time if you want to, but let me just give you some of the fascinating evidence for this, which will transform how you read the book of Psalms. You may or may not know that the Psalter, the book of the Psalms, is divided into 5 books. And scholars have argued, and I think this is persuasive, that the division of the Psalter into 5 books intentionally mirrors the 5 books of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, the Pentateuch in Jewish language is known as the Torah. And the word Torah, which is often reductively translated as law, actually means instruction. And so the idea would be here that in the first 5 books of the law, we get God's instruction, especially about how to live. And then in the 5 books of the Psalms, we have a companion for the journey of trying to live in that way. So that's the first way in which the Psalter is carefully set out as a literary whole. The Pentateuch is 5 books, and there are 5 books that make up the Psalter. Secondly, it's very, very clear, I think, that there is a specific introduction to the book of the Psalms, and there is a specific conclusion. So, and we can talk about this later if you want to, but there's persuasive evidence that Psalm 1 and 2 are the introduction deliberately put there to the Psalter as a whole. And as you may well know, Psalm 145 to 50 is the conclusion to the Psalter, in which the Psalter culminates in a growing crescendo of praise. Now, scholars argue, and there is some discussion about this, that not only are there 5 books, not only is there an introduction and a conclusion, but it is argued that the kingship psalms of the 90s in book 4 are the center of the Psalter. And it has been well argued, and I think very persuasively argued, that the overarching theme of the book of the Psalms is the kingdom of God. The same theme that is at the heart of Jesus' ministry. So all of this, is fascinating and some indication of the fertility of recent decades study of the Psalter. Now, within this literary framework, there are links between individual psalms, and if we had time, we could explore the intertextual links between Psalm 82 and its context and the Psalter as a whole. For now, just a few points or allusions in this direction. You will have noticed, and if you look at Psalm 82, it says a psalm of Asaph. Psalm 82 is the second to last psalm in the book of Psalms related to Asaph. Psalm 82 is also one of several so-called Elohistic psalms. Now, what we mean by this, they are psalms in which the name used for God is not the most common Old Testament name, Yahweh, which our English translations translate as Lord, capital L-O-R-D, but the name for God in these Elohistic psalms is Elohim, translated as God in our English versions. Now, it may be that these psalms use this name, and this is the name of God in Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, because of God's universal reign over the whole creation, because it is in view. But either way, it is quite clear in these Psalms that it is Israel's God, Yahweh, that is being referred to by this name, Elohim. Now, you know, what you can also do once you realize that the book of Psalms is a literary whole, you start having a very close look at the Psalms around Psalm 82. And it is interesting, Psalm 79 to 80 are communal laments, including in 79 verse 10, the poignant question asked by the nations, where is their God? Psalm 81 laments the fact that Israel does not listen to God and anticipates a time when there shall be no strange God among you. And Psalm 83, it is argued, prays for what Psalm 82 envisages, which is what we will come to. Both Psalms 82 and 83 end on a universal note about God's reign, anticipating a theme that is going to come to the fore in the rest of the Psalter. Now, I referred to the fact that there is an introduction to the Psalter and a conclusion. And it's interesting that Psalm 82 connects with Psalm 1 and especially with Psalm 146. So Psalm 82 connects right back into the introduction and looks forward to the conclusion to the Psalter. Now, I hope you've already noticed, and if not, please have a look at Psalm 82 again, that justice is a major theme of this psalm. And the word justice, or some version of it, occurs at least 3 times in the Psalter, and the concept, of course, is pervasive in Psalm 82. And the same root word occurs in Psalm 1 and verse 5. The phrase that many translations translate as in judgment. So there is some connection right the way back from Psalm 82 to Psalm 1 in terms of vocabulary. And then Psalm 82, with its concern for justice, also connects to the crescendo of praise in Psalm 145 to 150. And in Psalm 146, verse 7, God is praised because he is the one, and I quote, who executes justice for the oppressed, who gives food to the hungry. So this crescendo of praise, you know, we might think praise is just a great worship session, but it's really interesting here how the praise of God is connected to the fact that amongst many other things, he executes justice for the oppressed and he gives food to the hungry. Now, are you ready? Are your seatbelts fastened? Are you still awake? I hope so. But before we plunge into Psalm 82 itself, a comment about its structure. Now, if you've had exposure to biblical studies, you will know that biblical scholars love to try and articulate the structure of a passage of scripture. And one author has argued that Psalm 82 has a chiastic structure with you know, now, it's not that easy to explain what chiasm is, but if you're familiar with it, if you're not, it's a way of saying that the psalm is designed or shaped in a particular way so that different parts of the psalm are kind of in parallel. So let me just tell you what this author has argued. He argues that there is a sort of outer envelope to this psalm, and that is verse 1 and verse 8. He argues that verses 2 to 4 are in parallel to verses 6 to 7. Now, the very interesting thing about chiasm is what is at the center, because that might give you a clue to what the whole psalm is about. And he argues that verse 5 is in the center. This very interesting verse, they have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. Okay, so now if you didn't follow that, please just ignore it. It's just an interesting thing. What I do think is clear, whether there is a chiasm in the psalm or not, the narrative flow of the psalm is clear. Now, please have a look at verse 1, a psalm of Asaph, and then we carry on. And now, in verse 1, what we read is that God has taken his place or his seat in the divine council, or we might translate the council of the gods. Now, some of you will be saying, what on earth is this thing, the council of the gods? Well, this is where this psalm starts to become so absolutely fascinating, because the idea of such a council is well known in the Canaanitic literature or the Ugaritic literature, that is the pagan mythology of the Canaanites and some of Israel's neighbors. And they had this idea. Now, of course, they were all polytheists. They believed that there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different gods. And if you have so many gods, then of course they need to get together to sort out the divine affairs. And of course, gods can be very difficult sometimes. And so there needs to be a chair for this council. And in Ugaritic or Canaanite literature, the council was normally chaired by the god El, E-L. So what the author is doing here, he knows his context very well. And remember, many Israelites were often tempted and succumbed to the worship of other gods. And so he seizes on this motif of the council of gods to leverage it for his own purposes. Okay, now the council, as I said, in Canaanite and Ugaritic mythology, was normally chaired by the god El. Now, what is truly, and this is where someone who knew that mythology has just fallen off their chair. Okay, because the council is not chaired by El, it is chaired by the God of Israel, Yahweh. Here, remarkably, Yahweh assumes the chair, and instead of having a normal meeting of the gods with a normal agenda, we read that he holds judgment. Okay, so this is now a short psalm, but the surprises are coming very fast and very quick. So, you know, you're just thinking, oh, this is the council of the gods, El is chairing. It's going to be another one of these terribly long, boring faculty meetings or faculty councils or the sort of things that we're all so familiar with. And then boom, it's not El in the chair, it's Yahweh. And then, oh my goodness, did you see what's on the agenda? It's nothing like the normal agenda. Yahweh holds judgment. This is no normal gathering of the gods, but the council has been convened as a law court. And who is being prosecuted? The gods of the ancient Near East. So this is extraordinarily powerful imagery. And I ask you just to have a look at verse 1 and see if you now understand it. Maybe you did already, but if you didn't, that now you do understand it. God has taken his place in the council of the gods, or the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. So he's now going to pronounce his judgment against the gods of the ancient Near East. So I hope this has caught your attention. You know, you should be thinking, oh my goodness, what's going to happen now? Why is he going to hold them accountable? You know, this is extremely evocative stuff. In verse 2 to 7, we have God's case against the other gods. And like a very good prosecuting lawyer, God asks just the right questions that will bring his case against the gods to the surface. Now, have a look at verse 2 and see, I don't ask you to say this out loud, but see if you can articulate from verse 2, what is his case against the gods? Well, it's very clear, isn't it? They are accused of judging unjustly and of showing partiality to the wicked. Now, this is further elaborated on in verses 3 to 4, where Yahweh points out what the gods have not done, and thereby indicates positively how a god should relate to justice. They have not provided justice for the weak and the orphan. They have not maintained the rights of the afflicted and the destitute. They have not rescued the weak and needy. They have not delivered the weak from the hand of the wicked. Now it is debated, you'll see that verse 5 begins they. It is debated whether the they of verse 5 refers to the gods or to humankind. In context, it seems to me that it refers very clearly to the gods. And if Psalm 82 has a chiastic structure, as we as we said earlier, then verse 5 is the center, perhaps the central point of the psalm. Now, you probably know from the rest of the Old Testament that it is characteristic of the wise to know and to possess understanding. And here we learn that the gods of the ancient Near East neither know nor possess understanding, but flounder around in darkness. Now, I want you to notice the final part of verse 5. Their failure to execute justice is extremely serious. It's catastrophic for the earth, for the whole creation. And the psalmist says, the very foundations of the earth are shaken, a metaphor for the fact that the failure of the gods to execute justice threatens to undo God's creation. So there we have it in verses 2 to 4, God's case against the gods of the ancient Near East. Verse 5, a description of the effect of their failure. And then in verse 6 and 7, the judgment is pronounced. Now, what you need to hold on to your chair lest you fall off it with shock and surprise at this. He says, God, this is God speaking, I said, you are God, sons of El Elyon, that is Most High, all of you. Now here's the judgment. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. So most extraordinarily, and boy, you wouldn't have missed this meeting for anything, not only has the council of the gods been turned into a court with judgment being pronounced, but the gods are given the death penalty, just as Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden. And then the psalm ends in verse 8 with a prayer, calling on God to arise and to judge the earth, because you shall inherit all the nations. And there's an allusion to Psalm 2, the other part of the introduction to the Psalter. Now, you might want to take a deep breath and just ask yourself, oh my goodness me, what do I make of this psalm? Okay. Now, I should just tell you, for those of you who are interested, that in Old Testament studies, much of which is not always helpful, this psalm has become a classic psalm for a discussion of whether or not Israel believed in the existence of other gods. Okay, and I think you can easily see why and how that could be the case. Now, of course, that's a very interesting question, but making it the focus distracts from and misreads the powerful message of Psalm 82. As with so much of the Old Testament, Psalms are literary compositions. And I hope you've already realized that if you're going to understand this, your imagination needs to be fully engaged. Mays, in my opinion, is one of the very best commentators on the Psalms. And he notes that the trial saying in Psalm 82 was composed for performance in liturgy. Its report of what God is doing and saying would have been repeated every time the psalm was used in liturgy. Now, in my view, what the psalmist is doing here is using his imagination to bring some truth home to us. The psalmist imagines the council of the gods taking place as he describes, utilizing this Canaanite motif of the council of the gods, and he does so polemically. In other words, in opposition to it in order to make his point. And so Mays says, I think quite rightly, that Psalm 82 takes up that ancient Near Eastern worldview and gives it a particular Israelite or Old Testament expression. The psalmist's use of this motif of the council of the gods is, I propose, an excellent example of what Brevard Childs and other scholars have called broken myth in the Old Testament. And in broken myth, what happens is the author takes up the mythology of one of the other nations, uses it, but deconstructs it and breaks it in the process. Okay, so shows an awareness of it, like any good preacher. If you're going to preach, you've got to know what your people are thinking about. And doubtless, there were in Israel many Israelites who thought, oh, those Canaanites have got it right. There is a council of the gods, and Yahweh is only one amongst all those gods. So the psalmist utilizes this motif, and in the process of using it, he deconstructs it, he breaks it in order to make his point. Certainly, Psalm 82 depicts the council of gods, and certainly they are in session as a court. But all this imagery is in service of a liturgical celebration of and appeal to God's kingship. And the gods receive the death penalty. As Mays observes, Psalm 82 is in fact one of the songs in the Psalter that celebrates the reign of the Lord. It portrays God's reign not as a state or condition of things, but as something that is happening, an unfinished story. In several publications, Mays has rightly argued that the kingdom of God, the reign of Israel's God, is the major theme of the Psalter, and we see this again here in Psalm 82. Mays observes the portrayal of the assemblies of the gods. I think this is a very perceptive, one of the best readings of the psalm I've come across. This portrayal of the assembly of the gods is unlike any other because it announces the permanent adjournment of the assembly and the execution of its constituency. The psalm announces the death of the gods. Now, listen to this point. It is a way of saying, in a polytheistic worldview, I believe in God the Father Almighty. The notion of the council is used to dramatize a profound shift in understanding reality. The context for human life is not the careers of the gods of the nations, but the reign of the Lord. Now, I hope you, if I'm right, and Mays is right, I hope you begin to see what this psalm is doing. It's a very sophisticated piece of poetry. The author is aware that among the pagans, that they have in their mythology the notion of a council of the gods, a council at which the gods meet to discuss what is going on and make decisions. The Canaanites and all the nations of the ancient Near East were thoroughly polytheistic, believing in a gazillion different gods. Thus, they needed to have a council to meet, to organize together, and to discuss. The psalmist imagined such a meeting, but oh my goodness. Then Yahweh arises, chairs the meeting, turns it into a legal court session, and pronounces the death penalty on the gods. So firstly, therefore, this psalm is a profound reminder, as the Psalter will remind us again and again, that the Lord alone is King, the Lord alone is God. If you wanted to be a bit more theological, we could say that this psalm expresses monotheism, the doctrine that there is only one God. And can I just remind you, this psalm was not written for the Canaanites, it was written for the Israelites. Okay, so this is not some kind of horrible going after other people's gods and trying to be desperately difficult. It's the Israelites. They knew Yahweh, but they were constantly tempted and succumbed to going after other gods. And so this is a powerful, powerful reminder. The Lord is God, the Lord alone. Secondly, we need to note the basis on which the gods receive the death penalty. Instead of delivering, now have a look, please, again at verse 2, 3, and 4. Why are the gods being judged? What is the case against them? The case is that instead of delivering justice, they have delivered injustice. And, in parallel, you have this very powerful expression showing partiality in their execution of law to the wicked. So you go to the law court, there are the wicked, and the judge is partial to them and decides in their favor. Now, where Psalm 82 therefore becomes vitally important is in demonstrating that worldviews have consequences. And indeed, if you look at verse 5, according to the psalmist, the failure of the gods to deliver justice is catastrophic. It threatens to undo the very creation. And this alerts us unequivocally to the vital importance of law and justice in any society if it is to be healthy and to promote human flourishing. In his fascinating reflections on Moses and Pharaoh's court, and then in his adult years discovering his compassion for his fellow Israelites, leading him to kill an Egyptian, Leon Cass, as some of us read in our reading group, comments. You remember Moses, he discovers that, his fellow Israelites are being beaten up, and then he kills one of the Egyptians. And Leon Cass says this: Moses' aspirations are honorable and reasonable, and his question exposes a good ruler's concern to prevent wrongdoing. But according to Cass, his intervention is surprisingly ineffective. Cass says it is utterly naive. And he says this, which is very interesting: to pursue peace and justice, Moses must find a way to combine reasonable speech with forceful deed. To anticipate, in a word, he needs law, speech with teeth, the voice of reason backed up by the threat of force. Now, in the West, we have lived in relative affluence and safety since the end of World War II. And thus it is easy, I think, for us, well, comparatively easy, although the cracks are showing all over the place, it is comparatively easy for us to take the rule of law for granted. Having grown up in South Africa, I think one has a greater sense of the serious danger of unhealthy law and injustice in societies. Apartheid in South Africa legislated white supremacy across every aspect of life from 1948 to 1994. And then beyond that, in the new South Africa, we have watched, some of us with horror, as the government and vital infrastructure were literally sold off by the Zuma government to the highest bidders. One only needs to think of the genocide in Rwanda with 500 machete corpses floating down the river every hour. And more recently, the genocide in Sudan and, the situation in Afghanistan, and one can go on, to provide further illustrations of the breakdown of law and justice. So not only does this psalm alert us to the fact that there is only one God, secondly, it alerts us to the fact that law and justice are of fundamental importance for the creation and for every society. But now I want to ask you this question, and I'm afraid this is where I may upset some of you, but let me hasten on. And please remember, you can ask in question time. What does law and justice look like? Let me just repeat that question. What does law and justice look like? Well, I want to ask you to have a look at verses 3 and 4, because I think there you've got a definition of what law and justice looks like. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. This is why the death penalty is being pronounced on the gods of the ancient Near East. And so this is now there are many other answers to this question, but you cannot get around this as a biblical definition of what law and justice looks like. Now, in Catholic theology, this approach is referred to as the preferential option for the poor. And I want to quote here from John Paul II in his encyclical Centesimus Annus. He writes, "Today more than ever, the Church is aware that her social message will gain credibility more immediately from the witness of actions than as a result of its internal logic and consistency. This awareness is also a source of her preferential option for the poor, which is never exclusively or discriminatory towards other groups. This option is not limited to material poverty, since it is well known that there are many other forms of poverty, especially in modern society, not only economic, but cultural and spiritual poverty as well. The Church's love for the poor, which is essential for her and a part of her constant tradition, impels her to give attention to a world in which poverty is threatening to assume massive proportions in spite of technological and economic progress. In the countries of the West, different forms of poverty are being experienced by groups which live on the margins of society, by the elderly and the sick, by the victims of consumerism, and by so many refugees and migrants. In the developing countries, tragic crises loom on the horizon unless internationally coordinated measures are taken before it is. So that's an example, a very balanced sort of statement from John Paul II on what is called the preferential option for the poor. Now, in case you think, oh my goodness, that's only horrible Catholics who believe that sort of thing. I love Catholics, by the way, but you might be sitting there thinking that here is an extraordinary statement by one of the greatest Protestant theologians of all time in the 20th century, Karl Barth. He says this: for this reason, the human righteousness required by God and established in obedience, the righteousness which according to Amos 5:24 should pour down as a mighty stream, has necessarily the character of a vindication of right in favor of the threatened innocent, the oppressed, poor, widows, orphans, and aliens. For this reason, in the relations and events in the life of his people, God always takes a stand unconditionally and passionately on this side and on this side alone, against the lofty and on behalf of the lowly, against those who already enjoy right and privilege, and on behalf of those who are denied it and deprived of it. We are all widows and orphans who cannot procure right for themselves. There follows from this character of faith, says Barth, a political attitude, decisively determined by the fact that man is made responsible to all those who are poor and wretched in his eyes, that he is summoned on his part to espouse the cause of those who suffer wrong. The man who lives by faith that this is true stands under a political responsibility. He cannot, says Barth, avoid the question of human rights. Now, what is amazing to me is that as good as the commentaries on Psalm 82 are, the one thing none of them, I mean, as far as I can see, everyone I've looked at, not one of them picks up on the uniqueness of Yahweh as the lawgiver in the ancient Near East. Now, you'll all be familiar with this, that God in the Old Testament is the one who gives the law. Just think of the 10 Commandments. I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of Egypt. We're so familiar with this, that law in the Old Testament comes from Yahweh, from God. Now, what we don't realize is that's absolutely unique in all the ancient Near Eastern cultures. In the ancient Near East, the gods were concerned about justice, but it was always the king from whom law came forth. In the old, so all the ancient Near Eastern nations, Hammurabi and his law code and so on and so forth, it's not the god who pronounces law, it's the king, the pharaoh, or the king from whom law comes forth. And Israel is absolutely distinct in this respect. So Remy Brague, the Italian philosopher, says this: the Bible avoids representing the king as legislator. The one lawgiver is God. The idea was an unparalleled novelty, absolutely acceptable in the ancient Middle East, where only the king made laws. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, has no real parallel in those ancient civilizations. The God of Israel replaces the ancient Near Eastern king in the role of lawgiver, so that the predicates attributed to Pharaoh in Egypt are reserved for God alone in Israel. Now, you would think that the commentaries would pick up on this, because this is all about, kings and law and so on, but they don't. In the Old Testament, God is the lawgiver and not the king. Now, there's a woman who's written a very interesting book called "But What's Divine About Divine Law?" And boy, this is an interesting question. Okay, so if the Old Testament is absolutely unique in that God is the lawgiver and not the king, you soon run into this question: well, what is it about Old Testament law that is so distinctive? And, Chris Wright is with us, who could answer this question better than me. And it is many things, but I think the answer is right here in verses 3 and 4. What's distinctive is the concern for the weak, the orphan, the afflicted, the destitute, the weak, and the needy. That, I think, is what's divine about divine law. Now, as we come to a conclusion, I hope you're starting to see why Golden Gate describes this psalm as one of the most worrying texts in the Old Testament. We should all be pretty worried by this point. If this is what God is like, and we are made in his image, intended to become like him, then you start to see that Psalm 82 has radical consequences for how we operate in our cultures and beyond. And no, this is not an emphasis unique to the Old Testament, which is not found in the New Testament. Let me give you one example. The Beatitudes with which the Sermon on the Mount opens, and the Beatitudes are the characteristics of the citizens of the kingdom. One of them goes as follows: "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." William Barclay evocatively describes this beatitude as the bliss of the starving spirit. The bliss of the starving spirit. But what does it starve for? Righteousness. Now, let me ask you a question. Is this, what is this righteousness that is being referred to? Is it personal righteousness? Certainly. Is it related to justification? Undoubtedly. Can it be reduced to personal righteousness? Never. It extends to righteousness throughout the whole of God's creation, to justice, just like Yahweh. Now, writing in 2011, and I'm going to use someone else to do the really provocative work so that you don't send the boys out to beat me up, as it were. But Clinton McCann, who really is an extraordinary commentator on the Psalter, says this about verse 5. Although framed in the worldview of the ancient Near East, this assessment of reality is strikingly, starkly, and chillingly contemporary. It is not hard to identify ways in which the foundations are shaking, ways in which the future of the earth is threatened. Terrorism, growing extremes of wealth and poverty that mean 30,000 children die every day of hunger-related pandemic, especially on the continent of Africa, that to date has created over 12 million orphaned children. Note the reference to orphans in verse 3. Climate change and so on and so forth. He says, even as the foundations are shaking, however, the fact is that the large majority of North Americans, and one could add Brits and Canadians and so on, have benefited and continue to benefit from a global socioeconomic system that consigns millions, if not billions of people to poverty. And this is why John Goldingay describes this as one of the most worrying texts in the Old Testament. He says, McCann says, in the final analysis, I submit that Psalm 82 is so very important precisely because it is so worrying. Perhaps it will be worrisome enough to unsettle those of us who look to the Psalms as authoritative, so that we might take a stand with the God who vehemently opposes systematic injustice, so that we might take a stand with the God who claims not only our lives, but the lives of all the nations, and who wills the establishment of justice for us all, beginning with the lowly and the destitute. Now, to McCann's list, I would add the unborn children, who are so at risk in our sophisticated cultures. And in preparation for this, I checked online, and the World Health Organization indicates that there are globally 125,000 abortions every day. We ought to be concerned about this. But so too ought we to be concerned about the brutal death of George Floyd. And in a globalized world, we have to become consciously alert to the ways in which our lifestyles are connected with those of the majority world. I wonder, as the media ceases to pay attention, what justice looks like in Afghanistan now that we have done our bit and departed in such a bizarre fashion. Of course, there is a poverty of not sharing the good news about Jesus, but evangelism needs to be carried out in word and in deed. And my hunch is that if the church became like the God we claim to worship, then our evangelism would be far more effective. The recent destructive riots in South Africa were at least partially related to the extraordinarily high unemployment in that country and the desperation of so many of the poor. Who will speak to them? Who will denounce partiality to the wicked and seek justice on their behalf? And so I agree with Golden Gay, a troubling psalm. I agree that this is a tremendously important psalm, and emerging from it, and I hope in our discussion we can attend to this issue, I find myself asking with one of the great monks of the 20th century, Thomas Merton, when will we become Christian?